Yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm a postdoc within the group of Uta König von Borste, and the majority of the work that I'm going to present today is about Uta's work that she did previously, so I'm kind of a replacement for her, so please be a bit lenient with detailed questions about some studies that I might not be able to answer right away. So let's start. Horses are regarded as normal farm animals. However, they are in particular ways a bit special and a bit different from other farm animals. So the majority of farm animals are kept for some specific purposes, such as for their meat or milk or eggs or wool. And horses are kept for different reasons. On the one hand, of course, we want to breed them, but we do not keep them for meat anymore or for their strength to pull cars or whatever. So they kind of became companion animals, and there's a somehow clear distinction between horses and other farm animals. So we kind of, this kind of brings horses into the special position that they obviously have some more advanced or some more advantages of living close with humans, such as having a really close and individualized relationship. But obviously there are also some cons because maybe sometimes we try to overprotect them by sending them out on the meadow with a blanket on and horse boots on, and so kind of restricting their movements and their natural behaviors in certain ways. So to look into horse welfare, we first need to understand how their natural behavior looks like. And horses are very gregarious species, so they live in big groups outside in the fields, so they have food all around them, they're free to move wherever they want, and if they get scared, they just run away, so as normal prey species would do. However, in our captive conditions, we keep horses sometimes in individualized boxes, such as refraining them from free movement for some periods of the day, and additionally keeping them away from the conspecific, so limiting their social interactions. During riding, we sometimes force them into unnatural postures, and additionally, we expect horses to not be frightened of novel or sudden stimuli, which is somehow against their natural behavior of just running away. So we might ask, which situations do horses encounter that might compromise their welfare? And obviously, there are multiple different aspects that come into mind. However, I want to focus here just on three aspects. On the one hand, the housing and husbandry condition that we keep them in. On the other hand, the interactions that we have with the horse while riding or while leading them and handling them. And additionally, looking at individual behavioral differences that might underlie their behavior and their welfare as well. And with this, I want to start. The individual differences in behavior and physiology affect coping capacity, but also general health. And as this diagram nicely shows, personality is somehow indirectly involved in animal welfare as well, because it affects not only the individual behavior, so how animals are reacting to certain stressful situations, but also their physiology. And obviously with the domesticated species as well, domestication and selective breeding further affects how emotionally reactive they are. So especially for horses, behavioral traits are often considered performance traits. So we select horses with particular behavioral traits to do particular work, such as that we expect dressage horses to be more sensitive, whereas jumping horses are probably expected to react in a much faster way. And in horses, there have been multiple personality traits that were tested so far and that have also been validated. And for example, it has been shown in some studies that personality affects the pain expression in horses, such as horses that do have back pain are more aggressive, or that extroverted horses show lameness stronger than introverted horses. So there seems to be a connection as well, a direct connection with welfare. So we were wondering about other capacities and individual differences that do not really qualify as a personality trait, but might still underlie individual welfare. And this is on the one hand, the self-control of a horse, but also the tactile sensitivity. And I want to start with self-control, which is generally defined as the ability to obtain a more valuable outcome through tolerating a delay or effort. And this has in humans been most famously studied with the so-called marshmallow test, in which children were given the choice between having one marshmallow now or after a certain delay having 2 marshmallows if they refrained from eating this one marshmallow first. And it has been shown that this ability to delay gratification is an underlying mechanism for multiple different cognitive processes, such as general intelligence, but also problem solving, trainability and aggression, but also obesity. And especially trainability and aggression seem to be very important aspects also for horses. And so generally self-control is involved in decision-making and future planning, and thus enables goal-directed behaviors. So we were testing horses with a delay of gratification paradigm to find out about their self-control abilities. And this delay of gratification paradigm basically gives the horses the choice between having either a less preferred reward immediately or having a highly preferred reward after a certain delay. Here, importantly, again, they only get the better reward if they do not eat the less preferred reward throughout this delay duration. And so we were wondering, do horses show self-control at all? Can we measure it with this test? And is their individual performance in this test somehow related to housing and husbandry conditions or behavioral problems in general? And we did this by first assessing the food preference of each horse by presenting them a less preferred reward alongside with a preferred reward. So in this case, it was a piece or a bundle of hay versus a piece of pear. And once we had established a clear preference for one of the rewards, the horses proceeded to a training phase in which the two rewards were shown with a 1 second delay. So a really short one, just to train the horses that the second reward would come immediately. Once they succeeded in this phase, they proceeded to the 2 second delay phase. And so whenever they successfully waited for the high quality reward, they proceeded to the next delay phase. If they started to eat the low quality reward, the test was terminated after some sessions. Oh, sorry. PowerPoint crashed. I'll reopen it. Okay, I think you got the idea. Okay, so we found that horses tolerated on average 37 seconds of delay on a group level, which is actually quite high, especially compared to other species that have been tested with a similar paradigm. I'm sorry, are you seeing the wrong screen now?
Yeah, we're seeing your note modus.
Yeah. Okay, now it's better, right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. So here I plotted the proportion of successful horses against the different delay stages that the horses were tested in. So as I said, we started with 2 seconds, and if they were successful, they proceeded up to a maximum of 60 seconds. So as you can see, almost all horses were successfully waiting for 2 seconds, and with increasing delay duration, the number of successful horses decreased. So more and more horses dropped out and stopped waiting. And at 60 seconds, it was still 45% of the horses that were successfully waiting. So we were not even able to assess the maximum delay duration, but it seems to be that horses are quite good at self-control, or show quite a high self-control ability. We found that older horses show better self-control compared to younger horses, as plotted in this graph, with here the age in month plotted against the maximum delay that each horse tolerated. And as before, we need to be a bit cautious with this result, as we find quite a ceiling effect here at 60 seconds because so many horses were able to wait that long. And we also looked at whether body condition, housing conditions, or hay feeding regime somehow affected this self-control ability, and we found no effect of these. To conclude, horses tolerated relatively high delay times. And since this is the first study that tested self-control in a herbivore species, it might be that herbivore species which just find their food everywhere all around them and do not need to wait until prey comes by, they might just be better at delaying gratification compared to other species which need to actually wait for their food to ripe or to to come by so that they can prey on them. However, we found big individual variation in how each horse was able to wait. And when we also saw that horses engaged in particular coping behaviors while waiting. And at the moment, we're analyzing this data in order to see whether horses that show particular coping behaviors are actually better at waiting. This age effect that we found, meaning that older horses show better self-control compared to younger horses, is also found in many other species. And this lack of an effect of housing conditions or behavioral problems or body conditions might simply be due to the small sample size. So we're currently testing more horses to get a better idea of what's going on there. And especially we're interested in finding out whether we find a link between behavioral problems or stereotypical behavior and trainability in general, in order to see whether those horses that show better self-control are actually less susceptible to develop behavioral problems or are easier to train at all. And if this is the case, there opens up another possibility, namely that with training, self-control can be improved. This has been shown in studies with monkeys and also rats. And if this is possible, this might be an important thing to add to horse training. Another thing that comes to mind when we think of interacting with horses is their tactile sensitivity. So we groom them, we put a saddle on their back. So it might be that individual differences in tactile sensitivity are somehow influencing how the horses are behaving while riding and their general rideability. So we assessed tactile sensitivity in a group of horses using two different methods. And on the one hand, we looked at the reaction threshold, so the minimum pressure that is required to elicit a reaction, with a so-called algometer on the back of the horse. And we also assessed the sensitivity, which was just a reaction to really slight contact with a von Frey filament, which is depicted in the bottom. And this is just a small bundle of hairs that is pushed to the back of the horse, and it's recorded when the horse shows a behavioral reaction. And additionally, the horses were ridden by a professional rider who assessed their rideability, so the ease and comfort with which the horse can be ridden. And this entailed in particular the quality of the rein contact, chewing the bit, relaxation, learning ability, the reaction to the rider's aid, comfort of sitting, and also laterality. And so it was found that individuals show quite a high variation in their tactile sensitivity. So some horses were not reacting at all, or only at much higher pressures than other horses. And that the intensity of the reaction at different body parts was highly correlated, which means that this seems to be an individual trait somehow. It was also found that stallions are less sensitive compared to mares, and there was no correlation between these different aspects of rideability and the tactile sensitivity, as it somehow was hypothesized. So what can be concluded from the study is that tactile sensitivity is individually different for small touches, but also for stronger pressures. So it seems to be an individual trait somehow. And in this study, there were different aspects of rideability were not related to this individual tactile sensitivity. However, this might be due to the rather small sample size. And additionally, that rather older or adult horses were tested. So it might be that they're just habituated to having something on their back, or they're more trained during riding. And another thing that horses experience while being ridden is the rein tension. So horses not only differ in how sensitive they are in their back region towards pressure, but also potentially in their mouth region. And as we put bits into the horse's mouth, it might be that the horses experience this differently. To date, there are many different bridles available, also bitless bridles, and this study wanted to assess whether some bridles are more comfortable to the horse than other bridles. And to do so, the study tested the voluntary tolerated rein tension. And to do this, the horses were equipped with their bit and bridle, and an algometer measured the pressure that was elicited by pulling forward. The horse was presented with a food reward, and it was measured the the strength that the horse put into pulling towards the food reward. In one study, 5 different bitless bridles were tested, whereas in another study, a single versus a double jointed bit was tested. And it was found that there was great individual variation in the voluntary tolerated rein tension on the one hand, and also that the different breed types differed in how much pressure they were willing to take. So ponies tolerated much more tension than warm-blood horses, and cold-blooded horses tolerated much more tension compared to warm-blooded horses or thoroughbreds. Regarding the different bridles and bits, it was found that a single or double jointed bit made no difference in tolerated tension, whereas the side pull somehow seemed to be more harsh than other bitless bridles, so horses were tolerating less pressure when they were wearing the side pull compared to the other bitless bridles. So this might somehow, or underlying mechanism for individual differences in this regard might be that the horses show different food motivation, but likely also that they have a different pain threshold. And other studies have shown that the rein tension is an aspect of rideability. So horses that tolerate a lot of rein tension are often considered to be less rideable or to be poorly rideable. And we need to take into account that poorly fitted bridles and a really harsh use of the reins can cause stress in the horses, and that this different levels of tolerated rein tensions, it might cause different levels of stress also in the horses. Generally, it's thought that bitless bridles elicit fewer aversive reactions compared to bridles with bits. So we need to take this into account while riding the horses to use a bit and a bridle that is also comfortable to the horse. And this brings me to the second part of the talk, in which I want to focus on the rider-horse interactions and how these might affect the horse welfare. Rider-horse interactions occur at multiple different levels. On the one hand, the emotions of the rider and the horse are central while riding. So emotions might transfer between horse and riders. Another aspect is the posture of the horse. So horses are sometimes ridden in really unnatural postures, and this might compromise the horse's welfare. Additionally, horses are used for very different training and usage purposes, such as dressage and jumping, and these horses might experience different welfare problems. And additionally, there is a multitude of different equipment items available, and these might additionally affect how horse-rider interactions are perceived by the horse. Major cause for riding accidents are fear reactions of horses. So horses are a natural prey species. So whenever they encounter something that scares them, they try to get away from it as fastly as possible. And this obviously causes not only injuries for riders, but also for the horses. It causes enormous stress on both sides. And if something scary, or if something happened, the horse fell or the rider fell, this also has some psychological long-term effects on both. So this might, on the one hand, obviously be due to the failure to recognize and predict the horse's behavior, or additionally that the horse is insufficiently habituated to multiple different situations. However, we were rather wondering, how can a rider prevent or dampen the horse's distress in these frightening situations? And to do so, it was started to look at, does it even make a difference if a human is present or not? So do horses behave differently to frightening situations when they are being ridden, when they are being led by a handler, or when they are free to move on their own? To do so, horses were exposed to 3 different stimuli, each once ridden, led, or free running. And these stimuli were either stationary and tactile, or they were moving and also included an auditory stimulus. The heart rate of the horses was measured before and after encountering the stimulus, and also their behavior was scored. On the one hand, their activity ranging from 0 to 10, whereas 10 marked a flight response, their emotionality from 0 to 10, with 10 again excited, and their reactivity, whereas 10 was here the least reactive reaction, and the time to calm down, again after they've encountered the stimulus. So here it was found that the activity before encountering the stimulus did not differ between the three different conditions. However, after, the horses were much more active when they were moving freely compared to when they were ridden or led. Concerning the emotionality, it was found that before encountering the stimulus, the free-running horses were much more excited compared to the ridden or led horses, whereas afterwards the emotionality was again highest when they were moving freely, because obviously they could run away wherever they wanted to. And the emotionality was the lowest when they were being led by a person, and somewhere in the middle when they were being ridden. The reactivity after encountering the stimulus was highest when they're being led, which means that this is somehow the reversal order as before, which means that they were least reactive when they're being led by a handler, and they were the most reactive when they were running freely. This can also be seen in the time to calm down, and the time to calm down was shortest when they were allowed to run freely, because they potentially just could get away from the frightening stimulus and calm down much easier, whereas it took the longest to calm down when they were being ridden. Another aspect is also visible in the heart rate of the horses, which was the lowest when they were allowed to run freely, and much higher when they were being ridden or led on a leash. So leading a horse resulted consistently in the lowest behavior reaction, potentially because the human is somehow better visible in front of the horse's visual field and might have a calming effect on the horses. Riding resulted in the strongest reaction, potentially because the horse was restricted in its movement and could not see a human that might have calmed him or her down. And the free running resulted either in the lowest or the highest reaction, potentially because they were just free to express their flight behavior, which allowed them to calm down much faster afterwards. So the presence of a human might have a calming effect on horses in frightening situations. So yes, the presence of a human makes a difference, but doesn't matter if it's a familiar or an unfamiliar human. So to assess this question, horses were tested again, or different horses were tested again with a novel object test. And they experienced this novel object in 3 trials, once with a familiar rider and twice with an unfamiliar rider. And 3 different horse populations were tested in this study. So these horse populations differed in terms of their relationship with the rider, with police horses obviously having the closest relationship with their rider because they're working together multiple hours a day. Another population were riding school horses, which have the least close relationship with their rider because they're just experiencing so many different riders throughout the day. And also privately owned horses were tested, which are potentially somewhere in the middle. So again, the heart rate was observed, and here it was found that police horses had the lowest heart rate if they were ridden with a familiar handler, whereas privately owned horses and riding school horses had a much higher heart rate. This is potentially also due to the fact that police horses are much more habituated to sudden stimuli compared to other horses. However, when the same horses were tested with an unfamiliar rider, the police horses had a higher heart rate, however, still lower than privately owned horses, but not lower than riding school horses. And now looking at the difference between the familiar and unfamiliar rider, it's quite obvious that the familiar rider has a calming effect in the police horses, whereas not in the privately owned horses. And interestingly, for the riding school horses, it's the exact opposite, as they had a lower heart rate when they were ridden by an unfamiliar rider compared to a rather familiar rider. Here it needs to be noted that the unfamiliar riders were all really well-trained riders, so potentially their skill level somehow had an effect as well. So this means that only if riders and horses have a particularly strong relationship, a familiar rider can decrease the fear behavior in a frightening situation and might act as a social buffer. And additionally, well-trained unfamiliar riders can have a calming effect on horses as well. So yes, the presence of a familiar rider has a calming effect, but what about his or her reinforcement while riding? So another study assessed, again with a novel object test, horses' reaction towards the novel object with two different conditions. On the one hand, the riders were equipped with spurs and a whip, and they used this equipment with an increasing intensity while walking towards the novel object. The horses were not allowed to explore the novel object in this condition. In another condition, the riders were only using their natural aids, so no whip and spurs, and they used a constant reinforcement rate, and the horses were allowed to explore the novel object. Here it was found that the reactivity was slightly higher if the rider used a whip and spurs. However, this was not significant. Whereas, interestingly, the heart rate was significantly lower if the rider only used natural aids, and was higher when the rider used whips and spurs. The heart rate variability did not measure. The heart rate variability did not differ, sorry. So to conclude, the study found that spurs and whip did not cause undue stress, meaning that the heart rate was not significantly increased just by the use of this. And negative reinforcement and increasing intensity did also not speed up passing. So if a rider is using increasing force and additional equipment, this does not mean that a horse will pass a frightening object faster than if only natural aids are being used. So apart from the equipment and additional aids, also the mere emotional state might somehow transfer between rider and horse. And to assess this, Ute conducted a study with first fear conditioning the horses. So the horses were conditioned to associate a sudden event, like a sudden appearance of a novel object, with a certain auditory stimulus. The riders were not involved at this time. Then in the test, the horses were ridden on a predefined track, and they experienced this conditioned stimulus and also some unconditioned stimuli, which they had no reference to. So these stimuli were all just auditory in the test. Then they were tested in multiple different conditions in a semi-randomized order. So on the one hand, they were tested with the stimulus that they was previously fear conditioned to. So the horse was scared. The rider did not know what this sound meant for the horse. So the rider was uninformed. In another condition, the rider was scared in this regard, meaning that a sound was played which had no meaning to the horse, but the rider was told beforehand that a sound will be played and the horse will be frightened. In another condition, this conditioned sound was played to the horse, meaning that the horse experienced a sudden event, and the rider was told before that a sound will be played, to which the horse will react in a scared way. As a control, another sound was played, which the horses were not conditioned to, and the rider were told that this sound had no meaning to the horse. Here the horse's heart rate, but also the behavior was measured. And concerning the heart rate, it was found that, again, both were scared in red. In dark yellow, the horse was scared. In light yellow, the rider was scared, and in green, the control. And as you can see, the reaction or the heart rate was higher if both were scared or only one of the partners was scared, whereas it was lower in the control. And interestingly, if we look at the rider scared and the control, it is the case that the heart rate was higher if only the rider was scared, whereas it was lower in the control test. And this means that somehow the nervousness of the rider transferred to the horse. And this seemed to happen in a really subtle way, as the behavior of the horse and the rider did not differ between conditions. So this means that nervousness can be transferred from the rider to the horse. And this has also been validated with a rather recent study in which the person was nervous that was leading the horse, and the horses were also the horses also reacted differently if the leading person was scared. Additionally, this contagion of emotion seems to be due to small changes in muscle tone and or the odor of the person, as a recent study has shown that horses behave differently when they're sniffing the odor of a scared person compared to a happy person. So in addition to these rider interactions, the horse's training might have an additional effect on the horse's response to a sudden stimulus. So in this study, it was tested whether dressage-trained horses and jumping horses differ in their fear reaction. And to do so, horses were fed from a bucket, and then a sudden stimulus appeared. Different groups of horses were tested in this study. So on the one hand, trained horses and non-trained horses, but also dressage horses, jumping horses, and horses used for mixed purpose. So here the time to resume feeding after the stimulus has occurred was measured, and it was found that the dressage horses needed much longer to resume feeding compared to jumping horses. And the same was true for their behavior during the test. So here it was scored from flight to no reaction at all across the 5 trials of presentation. And it can be seen that the dressage horses reacted consistently higher than the jumping horses. So this study concludes that jumping horses are reacting significantly less fearful than dressage horses, and it seems that this has also a genetic basis. And older and more experienced horses, so trained versus untrained horses, habituate really fast to the sudden appearance of an object, irrespective of their training, so whether they were trained for dressage or jumping. So another thing that we as riders do to the horses is riding them in different postures. So this study tried to assess whether certain postures, such as the so-called Rollkur posture, so riding the horse with a really small angle and the nose towards the breast of the horse, whether this Rollkur posture is perceived aversive to the horse. And to do so, horses were given a choice between either being ridden in a normal posture or being ridden in a Rollkur posture. And the horses were first conditioned to associate these different riding styles, or the different sides of this maze, with a particular riding style. So they were ridden consecutively with Rollkur on the one side, and on the other side exclusively with a natural posture. Then they were given the chance to select the side that they wanted to be ridden in. And they were tested as long as they developed a certain side preference here. So it was found, just based on the behavior, that the horses showed much more aversive reaction if they were ridden in this Rollkur posture. So they were crabbing more, they showed more attempted bucks, head tossing, and also tail swishing, compared to when they were ridden in the natural posture, which already means that this posture is somehow aversive to the horse. Concerning the preference, it was found that 14 out of 15 horses showed a significant preference for the natural posture. And now in the second part of the study, it was assessed whether being ridden in this posture somehow also affects the horse's emotionality, so how they are reacting to sudden stimulus. And so in the second part of the study, again, 10 horses were tested. They were first being ridden in either one of the 2 postures, and then they were exposed to a rather sudden novel object or a looming stimulus. It was found that if the horses were ridden in a Rollkur previously, they reacted much stronger compared to when they were ridden in a natural posture. And also the heart rate was, which is depicted here, the heart rate was much higher if they were being ridden in a Rollkur posture compared to a natural posture. So this means, on the one hand, that horses avoid being ridden in this particular posture with the extreme neck flexion, and also that this leads to, being ridden in this posture leads to high emotional arousal compared to a natural flexion. So this Rollkur compromises the welfare of the horses, and it also puts them out for a greater risk of injuries, because the horses are reacting in a much stronger way, potentially also because they cannot see their surroundings that well anymore. So just to sum this up, so it seems that the presence of humans somehow dampens the fear response of horses. So if they're being led, they react less fearful compared to when they were ridden or free to move. Also, the familiarity of the rider has an effect, meaning that if they are being with a familiar rider, their fear reaction can be lower compared to when they're with an unfamiliar rider. However, this seems to depend greatly on the relationship with the rider. Concerning their nervousness, it seems that a relaxed rider can dampen the fear response compared to a nervous rider, and also that natural aids might lead to a lower fear response. However, this study was not that conclusive. Generally, concerning training and usage, so those horses that are selectively bred and trained for jumping show a lower fear response compared to horses that are being used for dressage. And the neck flexion also has an effect on the horse's fear reaction, meaning that if they're riding in the natural posture, they show a smaller fear reaction compared to when they're being ridden in a Rollkur posture. And this brings me to the last part of the presentation, in which I want to look at the effects of housing and husbandry on horse welfare. So this study tried to assess whether behavioral and health problems are more common in certain housing conditions compared to others. And to do so, the data from a horse insurance company was collected, and these horse owners that had an insurance at this company were additionally sent a questionnaire. It was noted the number of injuries and sickness of each horse, whether the horse shows abnormal behavior, how the housing and husbandry conditions are like, what the horse is used for, also the type of work, but also whether the horse shows excessive fearfulness or aggressiveness. Amongst these participants, the most prevalent behavioral problem was windsucking, while also excessive fearfulness occurred quite often. Teeth grinding, aggressiveness, box walking, weeping, wood chewing, and pawing occurred much less, and also some other behavioral problems were noted. So it turned out that these behavioral problems are more common in horses that are allowed to go out on the pasture or on the paddock only once or twice a week, whereas those horses that have daily turnout show much less abnormal behaviors. The daily turnout rate did not affect the number of injuries. Also concerning the feeding management, it was found that those horses that are fed roughage ad libitum show much less abnormal behaviors compared to those horses that are fed hay only in a restricted way. The feeding management did not affect the number of injuries. And concerning the housing, it was found that those horses that are kept in group housing show much less abnormal behaviors compared to those horses that are kept in single housing boxes. That type of housing did interestingly also not affect the number of injuries. And concerning the type of usage, it was found that dressage horses had injuries much more often than horses that were used for other purposes. So it seems that outdoor access to move freely in a group setting, as well as having a natural way of roughage, so ad libitum for the case of horses, are very important factors for horse welfare. However, keep in mind that this was purely a correlational study, so correlation is not causation, so we do not know in which regard these different housing conditions are indeed affecting abnormal behaviors or injuries. Another study looked at a very similar aspect, namely how do housing conditions, training regime, while rearing affect how the adult horses are performing as competition horses. And this study assessed or took the data from a German Association for Icelandic Horses and noted the number of participation in competitions between 2006 and 2016. Additionally, the owners of the horses that participated in competition in these 10 years were contacted and were asked to fill in a questionnaire in 2017, so 1 year later. It was particularly asked how the horses were kept as adult horses, so how the environment and training looked like, so whether they had access to pasture, the size of the paddock, and how often they were trained. Additionally, they were asked about the rearing conditions of the horses, so how were they kept as foals and how were they trained under the saddle, how old they were and how often they were trained as youngsters. Additionally, this study had the number of competitions from the association, so how often did the horse participate in competitions, how successful was it, and additionally the basic information of each horse was noted, additionally with the current usage and health of the horse in 2017. And this study was planned to find out how all of these factors affect the number of years that the horse is registered within this database. So meaning that the number of years that the horse is successfully participating in competitions. This is just the significant effects. However, it's a lot, so I just want to focus on these 3 aspects. So on the one hand, it was found that the age that the horse participated in the very first competition significantly affected how long the horse was active later on. So horses that were 11 years or older when they were first registered for their first competition participated longer in competitions compared to horses that were 5 or 6 years old. Additionally, it was found that horses that had a longer duration of access to a pasture were active much longer in competitions compared to those horses that were only allowed a few hours per day. And the intensity of the training also seemed to affect the success in competitions, meaning that those horses that were only trained 1 to 4 times a week were longer active as competition horses compared to those horses that were trained almost on a daily basis. Again, keep in mind that this is purely a correlational study, so we do not know how these factors are actually affecting the horse's health or success. So to conclude, it seems that individual behavioral differences might be able to affect the susceptibility of horses to suffer in non-ideal conditions and also to develop normal behaviors or to be simply labeled as problematic by riders. Riders seem to play a central role in horses' behavior during riding, and it seems that riders can support the horses in stressful situations. However, they can also compromise their welfare if they're riding their horses in an unnatural posture. It seems that housing, and here in particular access to outdoor areas and roughage, as well as training, so training the horses with a low intensity and starting them under the saddle at an older age, are central underlying aspects to a horse welfare. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to receive feedback or questions.